There was once a SpongeBob game where kids could make their own episodes. Not just play as SpongeBob, not just jump around Bikini Bottom. You could actually build little SpongeBob cartoons, place characters into scenes, add props, create moments, and turn SpongeBob into your own weird little animation project. It was called SpongeBob Cartoon Creator, and for years it lived on Nick.com. Then one day, like hundreds of other old Flash games, it disappeared. Today, pieces of it have been recovered, but the original version of the game is still considered only partially found. This is Forgotten Files. Case 001. SpongeBob Cartoon Creator. Status: partially lost. What it was. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Nick.com was more than just a website for watching clips. For a lot of kids, it was basically an entire arcade. Every major Nickelodeon show had games. SpongeBob had a ton of them. There were racing games, cooking games, platformers, puzzle games, and random little browser games that existed for a few years, got played by thousands of kids, and then quietly vanished. But SpongeBob Cartoon Creator was different. It was not just a game you beat, it was a creation tool. The idea was simple. Give kids a digital SpongeBob sandbox where they could create their own scenes using characters, backgrounds, props, dialogue, and animation-style elements. You were not just watching SpongeBob, you were making your own SpongeBob. And for kids growing up during the Flash game era, that was a big deal. This was the time when websites like Nick.com, CartoonNetwork.com, DisneyChannel.com, MiniClip, addicting games, and Newgrounds felt endless. You could come home from school, open a browser, and find an entire world of games that did not need a console, a download, or a credit card. They were just there, until they weren't. Why it mattered. The reason SpongeBob Cartoon Creator stuck in people's memories is because it felt more personal than a normal licensed game. A lot of SpongeBob games had the same basic structure. Collect objects, avoid enemies, beat a timer, serve Krabby Patties. But Cartoon Creator gave players control. You could make weird scenes. You could put characters where they did not belong. You could recreate moments from the show or make completely cursed little SpongeBob animations that only made sense to you. For a lot of kids, this was their first experience with making something online. Not just consuming media, but actually arranging it, editing it, and turning it into your own version of a cartoon. That is why games like this are so important to lost media. They were not always technically impressive. They were not always preserved properly. But they were part of how an entire generation interacted with the internet. And because they were browser games, people assumed they would always be there. Nobody was thinking about preservation. Nobody was downloading backups. Nobody thought, one day this game might be gone forever. They just played it, closed the tab, and moved on. How it disappeared. The disappearance of SpongeBob Cartoon Creator was not some dramatic mystery. There was no creepy shutdown message, no final announcement, no public funeral for the game. It just faded away with the rest of the Flash internet. For years, websites were built around Adobe Flash. Flash-powered browser games, animations, menus, interactive websites, and thousands of little pieces of internet culture. But over time, Flash became outdated. Security issues piled up. Mobile devices moved away from it. Websites redesigned themselves. Old games broke, files were removed, and eventually, Adobe officially ended support for Flash Player at the end of 2020. But for many Nick.com games, the damage had already happened years earlier. Games were taken down, replaced, redesigned, or simply abandoned. SpongeBob Cartoon Creator existed during a very specific window from around 2008 to 2013, according to Lost Media Wiki. After that, the original version became harder and harder to find. Some pieces survived. Some versions or related files were recovered. But the original full experience, exactly as players remembered it on Nick.com, is not fully preserved. That is what makes it so frustrating. This was not some obscure bootleg game from a random website. This was SpongeBob, one of the most famous cartoon characters in the world, on Nickelodeon's own website. And even that was not enough to guarantee it would survive. What remains? Today, SpongeBob Cartoon Creator is listed as partially found. That means the game is not completely erased, but it is also not fully recovered in its original form. There are screenshots, there are memories, there are archived discussions, there are pieces of information preserved by lost media communities. But the complete original Nick.com version remains incomplete. And that is where the story gets bigger than just one SpongeBob game. Because SpongeBob Cartoon Creator is part of a much larger problem. The old internet was not built like a museum. It was built like a mall. Websites changed, games were swapped out, promotions expired, servers shut down. And when the companies moved on, a lot of the media disappeared with them. The only reason some of these games survive at all is because fans, archivists, and random people with old files cared enough to save them. A SpongeBob game from 2008 might not sound important. But for someone, this was the game they played every day after school. For someone, this was their first time making a cartoon. For someone, this was a tiny piece of childhood that they assumed would always be online. Now, the search continues through old hard drives, archived web pages, broken flash files, and people's memories. Ending. SpongeBob Cartoon Creator was not the biggest SpongeBob game, it was not the most famous. And it probably was not something Nickelodeon expected people to still care about more than a decade later. But that is exactly why it matters. Lost media is not always about legendary banned episodes or creepy tapes hidden in basements. Sometimes it is just a browser game, a game that thousands of kids played, a game that shaped their memories of the internet, a game that disappeared because nobody thought to preserve it until it was already too late. For now, SpongeBob Cartoon Creator remains only partially recovered. And until the full original version is found, this file remains open.